Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be with all of you. I'm Sunita Vishwanath with a very exciting and young group of Indian Americans and one Canadian American. And they will share their thoughts about the state of politics in the US, specifically after the presidential election.
One of the main, themes for me in this whole election was choosing between the lesser of the two evils, and I do believe both the candidates weren't, great in any way. And like I said, I was rooting for Bernie. I don't think Biden really, what I wanted to see. Comparing it back with 2016, again, we had the same thing, right? I think back in 2016, we heard the phrase, the lesser of the two evils. And with the two-party system, of course, that's kind of a given. And with the results, I don't really know how I feel. I mean, I'm glad it's not Trump, but I'm not, sitting there super excited for Biden as well. And I know that probably makes me sound like an extreme pessimist, probably, but I don't know. I feel happy and a bit relieved, but again, it's not like we have someone that is extremely better in power as well.
So yeah, what do we do? And like for those of us on the left, what do we do over the next 4 years? And yeah, I mean, so this may not be helpful, but I just want to share where I'm at, like almost emotionally, which is that if we, assuming that the Democrats don't win the Senate, I just am really not confident in the ability of the left to like exert any leverage in national politics. I don't really, the like any legislation that Biden passes will have to go through a Republican Senate, and so there is, the left wing of the party isn't at that table. And there is, like right now, people are pushing him to cancel student debt, which is good, and there will be things to push him on. Unfortunately, there isn't a strong left on foreign policy, which is the area where he has the most control, and so I'm not confident there either. And so yeah, I've been kind of I don't know. I was like, I despite the fact that I was happy that Trump lost, I felt really pessimistic after the election. And I've just been diving into local politics here in New York, where it seems like there is more potential. But then the other thing I want to say briefly is that another kind of scary kind of result of the elections is that it accelerated trends that we're seeing in America and across much of the developed world, which is that the center-left party, the Democratic Party, is increasingly becoming the party of high education voters across races, and is losing working class and low education support to the Republican Party. And that's an interesting dynamic for us to think about as South Asian Americans, as one of the groups with the highest education attainment rates in the country, where do we want the center left party to to be, for its main constituency, to be people who come from a similar socioeconomic and special educational background as us?
For the most part, Indian Americans are very, very progressive. I don't know anyone who's conservative who cares about politics. I know people are maybe apathetic, but definitely everyone that I know is very much democratic socialist and very progressive. And very, concerned about issues of poverty and having a more democratic and human rights centered foreign policy. And to build on what Akash said about how we can build influence, I think when Trump lost the election, there was very much a sense of just happiness over the relief that like a cruel fascist has been defeated. And that is a win. And it's a win because we do have the opportunity now to create pressure. And I think that organizers are working very hard to get Democrats to win the Senate in Georgia. But also, I do think that this is the time for progressives to come together and really build a progressive foreign policy that we can very effectively advocate for, because the president's area of most unilateral power is foreign policy and is foreign affairs. So having influence at the State Department, at Department of Defense, in other areas of trade and climate change, this is where we can really make an impact regardless of what the Senate outcome is.
I think Biden and Trudeau are really going to like each other. But aside from that, I don't have very strong feelings about Biden's victory, just like everyone else for the most part. But what I did feel particularly depressed by this election, in part, there were many things, but in part was the kind of public euphoria when Biden's victory was announced, because to me it was like sort of revelatory of the fact that it seems like we have learned little you know. I mean, in America, I guess I'm not American, so in America, people seem to have learned little because, I mean, if there was such a, I mean, Biden should have won by so much more of a margin considering the state of the pandemic. And I mean, so many people have said this, but had it not been for the pandemic, just like Modi won in a landslide last year in India, it seems like that could have very well been the case with Trump too. And so that in itself should be a very sharp indictment of the Democratic National Party. But it seems like this marginal semi-victory has prevented the Democratic National Party from really confronting a sharp enough indictment that would force them to actually change. And, you know, some of the trends that have been brought up, like Akash mentioned, how more and more there's a new, you know, emerging sense that the Republican Party is actually more representative of the working class. And so the populist left has been almost completely ignored and suppressed. And, you know, we're seeing this with Biden's, first choices, the foreign policy representatives that he's picking in his Republican state. So I don't feel particularly strongly about his victory in itself, but I do feel like, I mean, essentially, it would just be about how much of a public presence, how much more in the mainstream can the populist left bring itself in, so that we can counter this sort of return to normal, quote unquote, right?
It's a tough year to think about anything. You know, I think that in terms of our hierarchy of needs, even as individuals, but also just as a country, you know, when our basic needs of just like, you know, we got like one check back in May or something, right? Our basic needs haven't been really met through the course of this pandemic. And as a result, I think it was hard to focus on the election, although it did feel like I was hovering over everything, you know, a lot, like checking my phone constantly and texting with friends and trying to keep everyone in the loop. It did feel like, I don't know, like I was sort of out of body about it, because at the end of the day, it was still like, we're still in this moment, and we're still going to be in this moment no matter who is president in January. And my sense in, you know, being in a red state while all this was happening was, I remember being really bummed out that I couldn't be in the street partying, you know, like I was seeing in New York City. I was getting all, you know, all these Snapchats of my friends in Brooklyn, like on their balconies, just like cheering and playing instruments and dancing in the streets and everything. And I opened my door and it was pretty quiet. And actually this summer I engaged with a protest at the Tennessee State Capitol building. We were occupying that space to encourage Governor Lee to remove some of the Confederate statues that were in the Supreme Court House in Tennessee. We occupied that space for almost 3 months, actually, 24/7. And the day that Biden won the election, a bunch of Trump counter-protesters, Trump protesters went to the same Capitol grounds and did a protest there. Now, when we were there, we were met with somewhere between 100 to 120 Tennessee State troopers, all armed to the gills with riot weapons. And of course, when the Trump supporters went and protested, they were just like, step right in. So they kind of rolled out the red carpet, as it were. So it's tough to feel a little isolated in a place like that, where people my age, I feel like, are all on the same page. But just to kind of know that in general, you're living in a space where you know, people voted for Trump, and people wanted 4 more years of that. And so it's you kind of have to carve out your space and carve out your security net of people around you, because otherwise sometimes it can feel unsafe, and it's a hard time to feel unsafe because we're already operating from this, you know, very baseline, bare minimum of you know, how we're all being affected by the pandemic.
A lot to dive into right there. So first of all, in terms of like bridging the divide and talking to people with different political issues, I think the reason we're not able to do that is because we're not talking about the issues. Like, I was relieved about the result of this election in the sense that, okay, we're putting off complete descent into authoritarianism for another 4 years, maybe, but there's so much more work that needs to be done. And I don't think that both parties are addressing it in terms of the pandemic, in terms of not exacerbating income inequality, and in terms of making sure that our economy bounces back for everyone and not just the people at the top. And I think that really showed in lackluster turnout for Democrats this year, especially among Latinx voters, working class voters, because Democrats were not talking about the economy. They never talk about the economy. When Republicans talk about the economy, they talk about it in cultural, racist-y, tropey ways, but they do talk about the economy in one way or another. And so I think in order to bridge the divide, to have these conversations with people, we need to talk about the issues that are impacting most Americans right now, and it doesn't seem like either party is. And to answer your question about generational divide, I think my parents share a lot of the same sentiments. I think I've successfully radicalized them during the quarantine period to a certain extent. But I do think there's a fair amount of cognitive dissonance among elders in the Desi community in terms of Indian politics and American politics, and keeping the two in separate silos, which is sometimes concerning because a lot of the trends that we're seeing here in terms of authoritarianism and fascism are what we're seeing in India as well right now. And so the cognitive dissonance with that is a bit concerning. And in terms of how this presidency could turn out, I can see it going one of two ways. Either we won't see much progressive legislation come out due to what other people mentioned, like a lack of leverage on the left and institutional constraints like the filibuster, and a very unclear Biden mandate. The fact is that 69 million people voted for Trump, and I don't think that number can be ignored. This presidency might just be a holding pattern just for us to see what happens in 4 years. But I think we also have to have a little bit of hope, and I think radical imagination is a really important part of political organizing, political engagement, and also just imagining a better future. This presidency could also be the clearest sign that we've had of a major political realignment and the death of Reaganism. If you think about it, Trump didn't run as a Reagan Republican. He ran as an economic populist, and even though his record in office might be different, that's not what he campaigned on. And so the ascendancy of the progressive wing, particularly in the Democratic Party, even though they may not have a lot of institutional influence yet, the fact that the media conversation around leftists has changed, we're seeing more leftists and progressives win primaries, and they've been really successful with base building. I know that DSA membership soared after the 2016 elections, continuing to climb. And the fact that a lot of progressive organizations are really trying to shape Biden's political appointee selection, I think that's all indicative of the fact that, if Democrats recognize and accept that shift and are clued into what they're seeing right now and pivot to the economy, this could really be a major reconstructive moment for us as Americans.
So concerning I've heard a lot of we need to figure out why Black or Latinx voters have voted for Trump, or why would they even choose Trump? And I think the important thing to remember is that the Obama administration wasn't as angelic as we thought. There's a phrase I like to use: Trump is a loud fascist. He does everything loudly and rudely, and he's just very you see what he's doing, and there's kind of this sick hatred in you. At least for me, I always feel oh, how could we be doing this? This is such a bad thing. But Obama and Biden spent almost 8 years in office, and I can't really substantially say what they did for the working class, or what they did to defund police, or stop all the problems that are in our nation. Deporting immigrants didn't start with the Trump administration. Trump just upped those numbers exponentially. So when we look at why are people voting for Trump, and why a seemingly shoo-in election has become so gripping on the edge of our seats, it's because the Democratic nominations have failed this country before. And this isn't to say that Biden's election wasn't good. It was necessary. It's chess, right? It was a piece, it was a right move, and that's a move that will save many lives in this nation. But it's up to us, and it's up to the new administration to make sure that that move was worth it, and that we'll actually see progress. Because if we don't see progress, I'm betting you a lot of voters will go back to Trump view politicians. That's my take on it. Now, in terms of identity politics, identity politics are the bane of my existence. I've started to hate it extremely, and the reason is you can be an LGBT, Black, transgender, working class person, and you can have the most conservative views, right? And this doesn't matter. Your face, how you look, it doesn't matter. What matters is the decisions that you make when going into office. And I think the problem with identity politics is that people kind of say oh, there's an Indian woman as vice president. That's so cool. That would be so cool. And they fail to actually see what these people are campaigning for, or what views these people have held in the past. And I think that's very dangerous. The most dangerous thing about elections, as I've observed through like working at the polls and like doing like all this sort of like activist stuff, is that people look at this presentation. And it's like a psychological thing, like people prefer like happy, smiling people. It's like that whole thing. But we need to push for voting to be like, what is this person actually saying? What is this person actually campaigning for? So if we can move past like identity politics, while I do think it is important to have representation, I think that representation has to be in like ideas. I would much rather value the thoughts of like a man who basically has been through like, for example, like in labor movements, or he's been through like he went and helped defund the police. Even if this white person were to take the like experiences and the advices of people who have been in this movement, in these movements, and who have been activists for a long time, I think the most important thing is perspective. It's who is willing to listen. And I mean, that's sort of like, I think representation is great. We need it in like not politics, like TV, video games, stuff like that. That's where kids should see it. We shouldn't be like, we need a woman, but then that woman's like going and voting to like abolish like birth, like, you know, labor rights or like abortion rights. Like, it doesn't work that way. We have to think about like what will bring this country forward.
On the point of identity politics, I agree with Harshini. It's definitely something that I've like grappled with a lot. I think that is valuable to an extent. I think it's really valuable to recognize that the ideas for prison abolition and a lot of these very progressive policies came from Black women, and the Black women speaking on their own experiences and their own what they saw in their communities. I think that's really important, but that doesn't always translate into action. That doesn't always translate into like the ways if they harm their own community, then I think that the identity politic doesn't really mean anything. I think like good examples for our own community are Indian American politicians who run but are also like endorsed by like the Hindu American PAC and other like Sanghi affiliated organizations. I know here in Arizona, Hero Tiperneti was a Democratic candidate and an Indian American candidate, and she was like praised for that identity a lot. But she also had got a lot of funding from these like ties. So it's like questionable what her actual stances on human rights and supporting actual Indians are. Yeah, so I think that it's valuable to look at. It's valuable to look at how are their experiences as this marginalized, as a person of this marginalized community, like shaping their beliefs, but with a grain of salt and recognizing that there needs to be action that accompanies that. In terms of minority voters voting for Trump, one thing I do want to note is like, especially for Latino voters, I think a lot of these minority groups are kind of being homogenized a lot. So Latino voters, I read an article that kind of showed that it was white Latino voters who voted for Trump in higher amounts, and that kind of followed like white voters like kind of in general, other like working class and that kind of stuff. Whereas like Afro and Indigenous Latino voters did vote for Biden in huge amounts. And I think like in our Asian American community, it can also be disaggregated a lot. While Indian Americans voted very strongly for Biden, I believe Vietnamese voted for Trump in much higher amounts. So I think like separating the data and like looking at each specific community more closely can reveal maybe even more valuable information. I also think like in terms of why marginalized communities, why a lot of like white working class people voted for Trump. I think Akash brought this up, that is like a lot of undereducated people who went and voted for him. And what I saw was like it was kind of choosing between white supremacy and a candidate who kind of never served their interests. And I think I think like maybe it is like a logical choice at that point, whereas like white supremacy is something like, oh, it seems like this is gonna like build me up, even if it is like a horrible ideology. It obviously isn't recognized as such, or obviously isn't recognized as white supremacy, but a candidate who's gonna like still uplift me because I'm white, versus a candidate who literally hasn't done anything, who hasn't done anything for me at all, hasn't done any policy that specifically help working class people, like universal healthcare. That can like those kind of material benefits haven't shown themselves. Yeah, so I think like it's like, why did people choose white supremacy over Biden? Is because Biden didn't do anything, the Democratic Party didn't do anything, and I think the only way to bring them back to the progressive side is to take really progressive action. One more thing I want to note here is like that I hope this election kind of showed is what the limits of voting as a means for change are. While definitely it is extremely important to cast a ballot in every single election, I think that we need to figure out how to move beyond it. Because when we had like two choices between Biden and Trump that would dictate the lives of so many people, like it's like it needs to be it should be obvious, like, okay, there has to be another way that we can do things in this country. I think like focusing on a very local level and community organizing is super important. Things like donating to mutual aid funds to support the most marginalized communities there directly, like with our own pockets, instead of relying on, like if you're in a red state of government that will completely ignore them, attending like mass protests or strikes if you're able to push like local actors to do what we want basically. I think that those might be the most important ways to create change in these next few years and beyond. Um, and yeah, I hope that's like can be recognized.
With your second point of people back home in India, I'm connected to like a lot of young activists there, and many of them are excited that Trump is not in office, Trump is not going to be in office, because we know the relationship between Trump and Modi, and it wasn't a great one, right? We saw them shake hands, they were basically best friends, and I think the good thing with the Biden administration that we can do is we can definitely apply pressure and hope that, you know, he doesn't have people on his team that are backed by, you know, RSS groups here. So I think that a lot of people, especially people back in India, a lot of young people are looking at us to focus and put pressure on the Biden administration, so we don't have the same thing that we had with Trump and Modi. And with just, you know, I don't know, what does this mean for India? I think it's good, and I think that it gives a lot of activists opportunity, and it really, I think it's our time right now, like at this moment, to put pressure. So I'm excited in a way. I feel a sense of responsibility, and I think that many people here will relate to that as well.
It feels, for someone who has spent 99% of my life here, it sometimes feels just kind of like the boogeyman or something. It's like no matter how bad the problems are here, I imagine that it just and everything that I've heard, it just feels so much. The stakes feel so much higher, and it feels like it's so much older of a country, right? So things are just so much more ingrained. If you think about Hindu fundamentalism and Hindutva, it's like I have had to wrestle with this idea that in some ways, like that was the blueprint for systemic racism for the rest of time, you know, and that happened so long ago. And there's some shame, I think, internally that I have around that, you know. I think to a lot of my friends who have like a very like tertiary understanding of Indian culture, you know, there's like India, like yoga and Buddhism and things, and I'm just like, yeah, and also systemic racism, like these were sort of like I said, foundational things that then people mirrored and copied to create unjust systems. But I do think, like, while I'm not in touch necessarily with young people in India about those things, I think it's encouraging to see, you know, the way that in spite of all these odds, in spite of the stakes being high, in spite of the risk of loss of life and you know, your family's security, that there are still young people there fighting, and that there are you know, that there was that Dalit girl that was recently raped and killed and cremated without her parents' knowledge, and you know, there was something unifying about seeing that uprising, and reminded me so much of what was happening here with George Floyd. But there's something also like, there's this sour taste in my mouth about the fact that it's like, okay, I know that happens all the time and has happened all the time forever and ever. And it's like, why did it take till now for this to, you know, have this spike? I don't really know, but I think that there is momentum now, and anything that we can do on this side, like I think my tone is changing about the way I've seen these things, and it's sort of like, you know, you can hide under your Americanized rock for only so long, and it's time to kind of go back and connect and help in any way that we can, and like use the privilege that we have of being in this place where we can express ourselves with, you know, for the majority of us, we can express ourselves without fear of loss of life and security, and you know, we got to use that to help back home now.
Can I actually respond to one of the questions maybe that I asked was why did it take so long in India for there to be an uprising or a protest and all of that? And I think one of the reasons for that is because the people that are oppressed in India are the ones that are, you know, completely they don't have a voice, right? Like with India and caste, I was speaking to Dadasaheb Tandil, who Sunita probably knows, and he's a PhD here, but he was telling me about how he is, 1 in a million. Where many people in India who are Dalits, who are the untouchable caste, their day-to-day thing is, how am I going to get my next meal, right? How am I going to feed my children? So there isn't much time to think about revolution. There isn't much time to think about protesting and all of that. But obviously, we are seeing that now, and I think it's better now than it is already too late with what Modi is doing. But I just kind of wanted to answer that.
I can talk about some policy options that might go forward in the Biden administration. So one of the things that probably isn't going to change is the economic and military relationship between India and the US. And I don't think that it's going to make much of a difference. It's going to continue. And I think that if it stops, that would be bad, because we would see a closer alliance between India and Russia, which I think would be worse for authoritarianism in India. But I think some of the things that we might see a push for are first investigations and fact-finding missions from, for example, the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, the State Department, the United Nations, which wouldn't have happened under Trump. And another thing that we could see and push for is for the Biden administration to invest more in the National Endowment for Democracy, and to invest more in encouraging civil society to grow in India that is independent. And these are two ways that things that would be not controversial enough to make India mad at us, but also would allow to kind of push the envelope on India's encroachment upon minorities and authoritarianism. Two of the options that I would like to see as a progressive, but I think we would have to really push for, are, for example, sanctions against lower level officials who might be complicit in human rights violations and attacks, and also broadly speaking around the world, sanctions on things that are used for surveillance and monitoring of minority communities, because often this is used to further encroach upon their human rights and attack them and perpetuate violence. And this is something progressives are advocating for, and it is something that definitely I think we have the room to push the Biden administration on, but it would really have to take a strong grassroots effort to do this. And as for the other part of the question that you were asking about people in India, young people in India, the people that I know who are Hindu and upper caste, they are, all very anti-Modi. I don't actually know. I think I maybe know only one person who is pro-Modi, and he lives in the United States. So I think that there is a large portion of people who are against the current regime. And they're participating in protests, not as much as, Muslims and Dalits and people who are the most affected, right? But I think that does show that there is a generational shift that is happening, and that the younger generation does respect secularism and the Constitution and democracy and human rights more than this kind of middle generation that didn't experience independence and also isn't young.
So this is going to sound a bit rude, but I honestly think that we need to stop considering how upper caste Hindus, and I'm an upper caste Hindu myself, we need to stop making this whole movement about us, about, it's so bad that Hindutva is being mixed in with Hinduism, and Hindus don't know what real Hindus, that whole thing. I feel like upper caste Hindus end up focusing, and I was guilty of this for a while too. We end up focusing on that so much that we forget what this movement is truly about. It's about just misinformation and excessive policing and violating the Constitution and all these terrible human rights atrocities, and yet we're making this about how, I'm going to say random, how Lalita auntie feels about me saying that Hindutva is bad. This shouldn't be about us. It's honestly not giving people who are protesting credit if we make this about Hindus. This isn't about Hindus. Rama or Sita or Krishna, these will all be there for us, but continuously, they're institutions. But our country, the lives of Dalits and Muslims and poor people and farmers who are being cheated in this regime, their lives will be lost. This is stuff that will have lasting effects. And so personally, I do appreciate your question. I think it's important to think about isolation and the mental health of activists, but I think it's more important to focus on how are Muslim protesters feeling, how are Dalit protesters feeling. I think that there's entirely too much sympathy for the lone Hindu protester who was protesting alone in a family full of Hindutva supporters, and much less talk about actually what we can do to help as allies, as people who are honestly benefiting a lot from Modi's regime, even if we don't like it. So my point isn't that Hindus like speaking about it from a Hindu perspective is bad. What I think is bad is when we make this conversation, and I'm not saying anyone in particular here today. I've seen a lot of times if when we bring this up in conversation with other peers or people, Hindu people, especially people who have not been exposed to this like movement, will have the line of thinking of Hindutva. If I'm saying like, oh, Hindutva is bad, it's an automatic criticism of Hinduism. It becomes an immediate like it's the equivalent of all lives matter, right? Someone says Black Lives Matter, and then we're like, all lives matter. Like the point isn't that. The point is that people are suffering. This isn't about us. And so like I guess my point overall is that we need to think about how to expand our conversations, how to make this like from a, oh, this is bad for Hindus, or this is bad because Hinduism is being used in a wrong way, in a very like unjust way, to what can we do to help?
I think as a Muslim, I think one of the most important things, it really is so essential that we hear Hindu voices, especially at the beginning. It's kind of like it does feel like there aren't enough. Hindus are the majority in India, and a lot of them are silent. So to see groups like Hindus for Human Rights, for me, is very, very nice. And whenever people are saying that this is the Hindu-Muslim issue, I can be like, no, not really. We have this group called Indian American Muslim Council, and we have Hindus for Human Rights. So we have Hindus and Muslims working together for this issue. And I agree with Sunita that it is very important to continue to mobilize Hindus. And I also agree with you that the spotlight should be Harshni, that the spotlight should be on those who are marginalized instead of like you said, just praising. It's very similar to let's say a progressive in a Trump household, just praising them and taking away the spotlight from those that you said were marginalized. So I totally see where both of you are coming from.
Just to add to what Amina had to say about the role of Hindus and making sure that the movement against Hindutva is advancing. It also feels like there is an increasing tendency to view the Hindutva movement in a very one-dimensional way. Like it's either very much just about the suffering of minorities, or I have seen some takes where it's very much just about neoliberalism and using Hindu fundamentalism to advance a neoliberal agenda. So I just think that it can be about a lot of things at the same time, and within that somewhere, I don't think this is the main thing, but I do think that it is partly about Hindus, right? Like it is partly about how we can, this Hindutva hasn't just been happening since 2014. This has been a regular theme in the country. And so it is partly about what we're going to do when the violence is coming out of our communities, right? So in that sense, I don't think that we can immediately turn the conversation so much so about making it about something if we're just trying to talk about it, because it is about many things at the same time. It's a multidimensional, complex issue.
I think it's important when we're talking about Hindutva, when we're working against Hindutva, especially as people in the diaspora, to always make sure that we uplift the voices of people on the ground in India, especially those from marginalized communities who are at the most danger from speaking out, from protesting, because of how dangerous the situation is in India. And I think there are spaces within this larger movement for Hindus to be involved, but it's really important that we decenter ourselves and center the voices of more marginalized communities in India. But I also think there are real avenues for everyone to work together, like beyond the cultural and political aspect of Hindutva, like what Vikisha mentioned, like the real economic consequences of a Modi government of Hindutva ideology. It seems like there are more, from what I'm hearing about in India, there are more protests that are increasing with economic discontent, in particular with the Modi government's poor handling of the pandemic and how that's disproportionately affected farmers and day laborers in particular. And so I think there's a real opportunity there for mobilizing people along those lines. And I think that will also be more effective in the long term. Because we're seeing that now in the US. Like when the conversation shifts to the economy handling of the pandemic, that's ultimately where Trump failed. And I'm not comparing Trump and Modi, they're not exactly the same, but there are similarities there in terms of how activists on the ground in India and also us, people here in the diaspora, can better support their actions. And so I think part of that is also making sure that we, as Indians here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, talk to people in the foreign policy establishment, in our legislatures, and educate them on this issue. I think the main problem here is that there's such a myth of, like, India is the world's largest democracy, but really there's a lot of democratic backsliding in Illiberalization that not many people are talking about outside of India and outside of the diaspora. And so there's a lot of room there to really educate on that if we want to pave the way for policy changes here that can have a tangible impact in India. I don't know, speaking to your earlier question about the Biden administration, I don't know if we can expect much from the Biden administration beyond perhaps more serious diplomatic condemnation of undemocratic action in India. And I know that India is especially sensitive to American criticism, so that could be something that's helpful, that doesn't endanger the lives of people on the ground in India further. But it's unlikely that we'll see things like sanctions unless we really push for them. And we also really need to change the conversation around India from India versus Pakistan, because it seems like that's always consistently the only point when the American foreign policy establishment in particular pays attention to India, when Kashmir is involved, which is unfortunate. And there are other politics of that situation and dynamics there as well. But I think it's also important that we center the conversation on India as a nation and educate about India's history, and also really push back on the narrative that we're seeing being pushed by a lot of American allies of the Sangh, that any criticism of the Modi government is Hindu-phobic. So I think tying all of these threads together is really important if we want to build a cohesive movement to change what we're seeing in India, to reverse this trend and to really restore India to its place and really ensure that India fulfills its constitutional goals and ideas. I always think of the Indian Constitution as aspirational. I think it's what India wants to be, but I think like most countries, India doesn't always achieve what its constitution says that it should be. But it's important that we take a more critical look at this and figure out how we can join forces, I guess, and better support both activists on the ground in India and also do the most to decenter ourselves, both as people who are abroad and also as upper caste Hindus.
So I guess for the next 4 years, obviously, I do want to keep working with Sahi. I think that like the work we're doing is really meaningful, and of course, Hindus for Human Rights and IAMC, and there's like a lot of organizations who are really trying to do the right thing. And I think that hopefully, people, if you could maybe help us out, retweet our tweets, join our campaigns, I think that would be really helpful. As per like personal aspirations, I'm hoping to become a prosecutor, and I chose prosecutor just because I feel like there has been a lot of progressive defense lawyers who are joining, but not a lot of progressive prosecutors. So I want to help change the rather, satanic, that's not a very good word, but like the rather cruel thing that prosecution has become, and hopefully become like a prosecutor that will fight for people who actually need it.
So, like Harshni, I would also love to continue engaging with Sahi, and I can speak to a little bit of what we hope to do. We really hope to focus on base building, especially in the diaspora, like further engaging college students, especially those who share our background, who are from the Indian diaspora, who tend to be somewhat apathetic, but are also usually very progressive, but are somewhat unaware about what's happening in India, and really telling them what's happening and what's going on and building a base. And we're also really hoping to further research the Sangh and a lot of the financial connections that it has and the money that's flowing back and forth. Like the Hindutva movement, the BJP, the RSS in India would not be so powerful without a lot of the money they're getting and the funding they're getting and the other institutional support they're getting from members of the diaspora who are overseas, both in North America and Europe. And I would say more broadly to activists in India, please reach out to us. We want to support you, and we can't really claim that we are students fighting Hindutva ideology if we're not standing in solidarity and supporting, like materially supporting the people who are actually experiencing the brunt of Hindutva ideology and living in a state, a repressive state, that's becoming increasingly undemocratic over time. And so I just ask that people connect with us and join our movement and join the work that we're doing.
The thing that has really been most exciting to me has been labor organizing for a few months now. I really find that is a core component of the critical work of building justice and democracy. And that it's, that applies to America and India. And also sometimes I feel like when I look at the US elections and even elections here in Canada, actually, in terms of the Conservative Party base, and in India, when I look at the increased support for BJP, sometimes it feels like voters of the working class, and in India, the term is the oppressed class, castes, it seems like they're voting sometimes more so against liberal platitudes of the Congress and the PNC and here of the Liberals than they are voting for Modi and Trump and Andrew Scheer here in Canada. So, I mean, of course, there are definitely people that genuinely are, voting for these people, but I do think that there is a very large segment of the increased support among Latinos and Black people and the working class more so in the U.S. and in India and in India. Again, the increased support for Modi that comes from that place, and I think that rank and file education that is like actually organizing, opposed to this more shallow model of mobilizing. Jane McAlevey makes a very very clear distinction between those things. A prominent U.S. labor organizer is the way that we can combat that. We can combat that really politically pessimistic, like this political cynicism that I think is very sharply developing in the working classes of our countries. And to me, it seems like without that, it's an impossible task. So that's what I'm planning on doing for my bit.
And your message to your Indian counterparts?
Oh, follow the farmers. Movements. I mean, they really, we see with the win, with the very, very critical historic wins in Bihar of the CPI, the Communist Party of India in Bihar, that there is indeed a third path, and it's on its way in North India in a way that it wasn't before. And I think that's the path to not only countering Hindutva, but also the opposition, which is the Indian National Congress. Because I mean, we all have talked a lot about, are probably on the same page about the conditions that breed these kinds of fascists, right? Modi, or I don't know if I would classify Trump as a fascist, a neo-fascist maybe, but the conditions that breed these fascists are bad enough that we don't have to wait until these fascists to really be mobilized. So I think in terms of India, there's a strike coming up on the 26th of November. Farmers are striking in India, so like following Bharti, let's do all we can to support and to materially support too our counterparts in India.
I think that it's really important to recognize what as Americans we can do and what we can't do. And I think what we can't do is, dominate the conversation of a movement that is led by people in India and on the ground, and that's going to be how Hindu nationalism is ultimately defeated. But in the US, what we can do is look at our global influence and use that to leverage a situation where it's easier for activists in India to fight against oppression. So what that means for me is working with Hindus for Human Rights to advocate for policy, especially in the Biden administration, that's going to facilitate that. For example, asking for investigations and fact-finding missions from the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee to bring this issue to the attention of the American government, which largely doesn't pay attention to India, and also the world, because when we investigate something, it comes on the world's radar. And then also advocating for increased support for soft power, democratic challenging media organizations, civil society that are fighting against it. And then furthermore, sanctions against, for example, technology companies that are using problematic surveillance technology, whether that's in India or other countries. And through that advocacy, we can ease the burden on people who are oppressed in other nations through our influence. We'll never be the ones to save the world. That's a very imperialist idea that, that we can somehow change India and make it democratic and solve human rights there. But what we can do is just be a voice that's advocating for minorities and for oppressed peoples from the most powerful nation in the world.
I really appreciate everyone's points. One thing I wanted to bring up specifically in terms of, I think Vidya briefly brought up material ways that we can impact India in support. I think it's important to recognize that Indian Americans are like one of the highest, or of the highest socioeconomic statuses here, or highest like income on average. And I think that we should be using that wealth and kind of like redistributing it to both communities in the U.S. and communities in India who are being marginalized. A lot of Sanghi organizations gain a lot of support from soliciting donations from U.S. From Indian Americans, from Indians of the diaspora who are very wealthy. I think that we need to counter that by donating to Dalit organizers, to bail funds, to protesters, and marginalized communities and support them, especially now during COVID. I think that can be one of the most important ways that we're making change in India and in the US as well, donating to Black Lives Matter or Black organizations, Black trans organizations, indigenous communities here in Arizona, like the Navajo community whose land we are currently occupying. I think it's really important to give back and redistribute to them. One more thing I wanted to know really important is for Indian Americans to pay attention to, I guess, like how Hindutva ideology and how caste oppression kind of like travels with travel to the U.S. Paying attention to things like the Cisco lawsuit that Equality Labs is doing a lot of really great work on. Um, in terms of establishing caste as like a protected category in the U.S. as well. I think that both involves like paying attention to those issues and finding out and see like how can Indian Americans support that, but also acknowledging like our own caste privilege and realizing how caste privilege benefits us in the U.S. as well. I think those are like very important things to pay attention to. And then last point, and I've been talking forever. Vagisha talks about the farmers' protest, and I think that's also like that's also lastly a really important place that we can make an impact. Definitely, something that he has been doing for the last few days is taking videos of students in college campuses across the country, stating the solidarity and support with farmers protesting in India to kind of show that there is international attention around this. Because our biggest fear is that the police are going to get really violent when they do march to Delhi on the 26th. And making sure that if there are eyes watching, because currently the media is not, mainstream media is not paying attention to them, that if there are eyes watching the protests in India and what's happening to them, then the police won't be able to be as violent without incurring like human rights violations and that kind of stuff. Exposing it, bringing it out to the open. So sharing, retweeting this kind of information, as well as donating to these people, are all super important actionables for all of us.
So my personal plan is to do journalism, do local journalism, local political journalism in New York, which I do. I mean, so many of us, it seems like, are, especially at the beginning of the call, we're talking about ways in which the kind of progressive message is not getting through to enough people, especially within the Democratic Party. And I think building strong progressive media outlets is an important way to combat that. which is much easier to say in the U.S. than in India. And I'm just in awe of like the journalists that are working in India right now and I mean risking literal death. And I'm like proud to be on a panel co-hosted by a media vigil. So I guess I shouldn't presume to give any advice, but I do know that journalism is both more dangerous in India and in part for that reason more important.
So I definitely identify with what Akash said there. Like I think everyone's given some really good actionables, so I may not attempt to answer that part of it. But I do want to go back to also something Saket said, which is just that something that we can do internally here is that just putting pressure on the Biden administration to understand that Hindutva is on the rise here in this country, and that it did migrate here, and caste discrimination is happening here in a lot of workplaces, and we can kind of use that momentum to then put pressure on the Modi government, be it through the Committee of Foreign Affairs or whatever it may be. And I think that Brahmanism is the equivalent of white supremacy, so I do consider it all to be the same fight here, in terms of in the same way that I think recently we're seeing the commonalities between the Black Lives Matter movement and this movement. And I think that we're seeing voices from the American civil rights movement finally speaking out and acknowledging caste. So I think from here, what we can do is educate our peers, educate people around us. And like Akash said, I'm so glad to be working with Media Vigil because I think we're in the information age. So content, just like putting out stuff so that people know about it. I have friends that didn't know the caste system was a thing until they watched like one of those Indian dating shows on Netflix. And that was like their first, like, what is that? And it was just in passing. They didn't really understand what it was. And I always end up becoming the kind of designated person to explain all that. But I think that we could start making these things household names. And that's going to be really influential. And as for my counterparts there in India, like I think that, just when people ask me about what's the solution to systemic racism here in America, maybe forgive me if this is too flowery of a response, but I do think that my friends that I grew up with in a very white community in New Jersey grew up coming over to my house and eating Indian food and listening to Bollywood music and stuff. And it totally changed, when they went on to go work in IT where they were working with a lot of Indian people, it changed like the way that they saw their workplace relationships and like things where, some of their colleagues who had grown up in majority white spaces and never had that experience, they had less walls up and they were more inclined to create those close relationships. And I do think that's what it comes down to is like mentoring each other and loving each other. Because if you don't love someone from the Dalit community, or if you don't love a Black person here, how are you expected to be able to stand up for them in the way that we really need to? So building those relationships, continuing to put out content like Media Vigil is doing, I think are some great things that we can do.
I think that the first question was, what do we hope to do in the next 4 years? And that's continue to educate people. I think through everything here, we all know that people here in the diaspora, even Indians, aren't as educated as they should be. I was talking to a couple of reporters, and some of the things I'll say, that they'll question me over and over to make sure that they're hearing it right. When I say that India is headed away from democracy and secularism and all of that, it's hard for people to believe in, and to believe that that is the reality that is happening. So I hope that we can continue to educate people. I have a talk show, and we do a lot of segments on what's happening across the world. We talked about the rise of Hindutva here in the United States. We also talked about the situation in India, and hopefully we can continue talking about these issues. And talking about, I don't know, Sunita, I think that's very heavy. You said give a message to people in India. First of all, thank you for what you do. Thank you for standing up. I know that what you face is so much worse. We get a bit of online trolling and we think that's bad, but you have to face actual, threats and imprisonment and all of that. So thank you for what you're doing. And we support you all the way. And I hope that, down the line, we will be able to reap the fruits of the work that we're doing. And I just want to say that I support you, and we're in awe of you and the work that you do.
Thank you. And I will close by saying I'm in awe of the smarts and the passion and the thoughtfulness and the generosity of spirit of all of you. And I'm really, really excited about the future because of each one of you.